Hello, welcome to Anshika S Academy, and this is the series of Ancient Indian History. Chapter number 3, Nature of Sources and Historical Construction. Material remains, coins, inscriptions, literary sources, foreign accounts, village society, natural science, historical sense, constructing history or chronology. Material remains. The methods of archaeology help us to recover the material remains of the past relating to ancient, medieval, and modern periods of our history in India and many other countries. Archaeology is used to study prehistory and ancient history. Prehistory is concerned with the period for which there are no written sources, and history is basically based on written material. Prehistoric sites differ from historical sites in several respects. Generally, they are not in the form of permanent habitation remains, but principally of fossils of humans, plants, and animals. They are found on the hill slopes, and plateaus and mountains, and on the banks of nearby rivers with terraces, and comprise sundry fauna and flora. More importantly, numerous stone tools from the Stone Age have been found at these sites. The remains of tools, plants, animals, and humans from the pre-ice age indicate the climatic conditions that prevailed at the time. Also, writing was known in India by the middle of the third millennium BC in the Indus culture. It has not so far been deciphered. Thus, so the Harappans knew how to write. Their culture is placed in the proto-historic phase. The same is the case with the Chalcolithic or Copper Stone Age cultures, which had no writing. Decipherable writing was known in India only in the 3rd century BC, with the Ashokan inscriptions providing solid evidence for historical reconstruction from that time. However, despite the critical use of Vedic and post-Vedic literary sources for history in pre-Ashokan times, archaeology remains a very important source for historians. The ancient Indians left innumerable material remains. The stone temples in South India and the brick monasteries in eastern India still stand to remind us of the great building activities of the past. However, the major part of these remains lies buried in mounds scattered all over India. A mound is an elevated portion of land covering the remains of old habitations. It may be of different types: single culture, major culture, and multicultural. Single culture mounds represent only one culture throughout. Some mounds represent only the painted clay ware PGW cultures, others Satavahana culture, and yet others that of the Kusars. In major culture mounds, one culture is dominant and others are of secondary importance. Multicultural mounds represent several important cultures in succession, with which occasionally overlap with one another, as is the case with the Ramayana and Mahabharata. An excavated mound can be used to understand successive layers of the material and other aspects of a culture. A mound can be excavated vertically or horizontally. Vertical excavation means lengthwise digging to uncover the period-wise sequence of cultures. It is generally confined to a part of the site. Horizontal excavation entails digging the mound as a whole or a major part of it. The method may enable the excavator to obtain a complete idea of the site culture in a particular period. As most sites have been dug vertically, they provide a good chronological sequence of material culture. Horizontal diggings, being very expensive, are very few in number, with the result that the excavations do not give us a full or even adequate picture of material life in many phases of ancient Indian history. Even in those mounds which have been excavated, the ancient remains have been preserved in varying proportions. In the dry arid climate of western UP, Rajasthan, and northwestern India, antiquities are found in a better state of preservation, but in the moist and humid climate of the mid-Gangetic plains and in the deltaic region, Even iron implements suffered corrosion and mud structures became difficult to detect. Only the burnt bricks structures or stone structures of the Gangetic Plains are well preserved. Excavations have brought to light the villages that people established around 6000 BC in Balochistan. They also tell us about the material culture which was developed in the Gangetic Plains in the second millennium BC. They show the layout of the settlements in which people lived, the types of pottery they used, the form of house in which they dwelt, the kind of cereals they ate, and the type of tools and implements they used. Some people in South India buried in graves along with the dead their tools, weapons, pottery, and other belongings, and these were encircled by large pieces of stones. These structures are called megaliths. Although some megaliths do not fall in this category, by digging them we learn of the life people lived in the Deccan from the Iron Age onwards. The science that enables us to systematically dig the successive layers of old mounds and to form an idea of the material life of the people is called archaeology. Their dates are fixed by various methods of them. Radiocarbon dating is the most important. Radiocarbon or carbon 14 is a radioactive carbon isotope which is present in all living objects. It is like all radioactive substances at a uniform rate. When an object is living, the process of decay of carbon 14 is neutralized by absorption of carbon 14 through air and food. However, when an object ceases to be alive, its carbon 14 content continues to decay at a uniform rate but ceases to absorb carbon 14 from air and food. By measuring the loss of carbon 14 content in an ancient object, its age can be determined. This is because, as stated earlier, the decay of carbon 14 takes place at a uniform rate. It is known that the half life of carbon 14 is 5568 5568 years. The half life of radioactive material is defined as the period during which half the radioactive content in an object disappears. Thus, the carbon 14 content in an object that ceased to live 5568 years ago would be half of what it was when it was living, and in an object which ceased to live 11,136 years ago, its carbon 14 content would be one-fourth of that it had been when it was living. But no antiquity older than 70,000 years can be dated by this method. The history of climate and vegetation is known through an examination of plant residues and especially through pollen analysis. On this basis, it is suggested that agriculture was practiced in Rajasthan and Kashmir around 7000 to 6000 BC. The nature and component of metal artifacts are analyzed scientifically, and consequently, the mines from which the metals were obtained are located in stages, and the stages in the development of metal technology identified. An examination of animal bones shows whether the animals were domesticated and also indicates the uses to which they were put. I may add that archaeology provides a kind of soil archive which contains various material remains. However, for a total study of prehistory extending roughly up to 3000 BC or so, it is necessary to get an idea of the history of the soil rocks, etc. This is provided by geological studies. Similarly, the world of plants and animals keeps on changing through at a slow pace. Their history is provided by biological studies. Human history cannot be understood without an idea of the continuing interaction between soils, plants, and animals on the one hand, the humans on the other. Geological and biological advances enable us to understand not only prehistory also also history taken together with archaeological remains. Geological and biological studies act as important source for the study of Earth. 19% of the total time scale of history, starting with the origin of the Earth. Coins also, a large number of coins and inscriptions have been found on the surface. Many of them have been unearthed by digging. The study of coins is called numismatics. Ancient Indian currency was not issued in the form of paper as is the case nowadays, but as metal coins. Ancient coins were made of metal, copper, silver, gold, and lead. Coins molds made of burnt clay have been discovered in large numbers. Most of them relate to the Kushan period, that is, the first three Christian centuries. The use of such mounds in the post-Gupta period virtually disappeared, as there was nothing like the modern banking system. In ancient times, people stored money in earthenware and also in brass vessels and maintained them as precious hoards on which they could fall back in time of need. Many of these hoards, containing not only Indian coins but also those minted abroad, such as the Roman Empire, have been discovered in different parts of India. They are preserved mostly in museums in Kolkata, Patna, Lucknow, Delhi, Jaipur, Mumbai, and Chennai. There are many Indian coins in the museums of Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. As Britain ruled over India for a long time, British officials succeeded in transferring many of the Indian coins to private and public collections. In Britain, coins of the major dynasties have been catalogued and published. We have catalogues of the coins in the Indian Museum at Kolkata, of Indian coins in the British Museum in London, and so on. Nonetheless, there are a large number of coins that have yet to be catalogued and published. Our earliest coins contain a few symbols, but the later coins depict the figures of kings and divinities and also mention their names and dates. The areas where they are found indicate the reason of their circulation. This has enabled us to reconstruct the history of several ruling dynasties, especially of the Indo-Greeks who came to India from North Afghanistan and ruled here in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. As coins were used for various purposes such as donations, a mode of payment, and a medium of exchange, they throw considerable light on economic history. Some coins were issued by guilds of merchants and goldsmiths with the permission of the rulers. This shows that crafts and commerce had become important. Coins helped transactions on a large scale and contributed to trade. The largest number of Indian coins date to the post-Maurya period. These were made of lead, tin, copper, bronze, silver, and gold. The Guptas issued the largest number of gold coins. All this indicates that trade and commerce flourished, especially in post-Mauryan and good part of the Gupta period. However, only a few coins belonging to the post-Gupta period have been found, which indicates a decline of trade and commerce in that period. Coins also portray kings and gods and contain religious symbols and legends, all of which throw light on the art and religion of the time. Cowries were also used as coins, though their purchasing power was low. They appear in substantial numbers in post-Gupta times, but may have been used earlier. Inscriptions, far more important than coins, are inscriptions. Their study is called epigraphy, and the study of the old writings used in inscriptions and other old records is called paleography. Inscriptions were carved on seals, stone pillars, rocks, copper plates, temple walls, wooden tablets, and bricks or images. In India as a whole, the earliest inscriptions were recorded on stone. However, in the early centuries of the Christian era, copper plate began to be used for this purpose. Even then, the practice of engraving inscriptions on stone continued on a large scale in South India. We have also in that region a large number of inscriptions recorded on the walls of temples to serve as permanent records. Like coins, inscriptions are preserved in various museums of the country, but the largest number may be found in the office of the chief epigraphist at Mysore. The earliest inscriptions were written in Prakrit in the 3rd century BC. Sanskrit was adopted as an epigraphic medium in the 2nd century AD, and its use became widespread in the 4th and 5th centuries. But even then, Prakrit continued to be used. Inscriptions began to be composed in regional languages in the 9th and 10th centuries. Most inscriptions bearing on the history of the Post-Maurya and Gupta periods have been published in a series of collections called Corpus Inscriptionum Indicarum, but not many inscriptions of the post-Gupta period figure in such systematic compilations. In the case of South India, topographical list of inscriptions have been published. Still over 50,000 inscriptions, mostly of South India, await publication. The Harappan inscriptions which await decipherment seem to have been written in a pictographic script in which ideas and objects were expressed in the form of pictures. Most Ashokan inscriptions were engraved in the Brahmi script, which was written from left to right, but some were also incised in the Kharoshthi script, which was written from right to left. However, the Brahmi script prevailed virtually all over India except for the northwestern part. Greek and Aramaic scripts were employed in writing Ashokan inscriptions in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but Brahmi continues. The Brahmi continues to be the main script till the end of Gupta times. An epigraphist can decipher most Indian inscriptions up to about the 7th century if he has mastered Brahmi and its variations, but subsequently we notice strong regional variations in this script. Inscriptions found on the seals of Harappan belonging to about 2500 BC are considered symbolic by some scholars for Indian history. The earliest deciphered inscriptions are Iranian. They belong to the 6th, 5th centuries BC and are found in Iran. They appear in Old Indo-Iranian and also in Semitic languages. In the cuneiform script, they speak of the Iranian conquest of the Hindu or Sindhu area. Of course, in India, the earliest deciphered are Ashokan inscriptions. They are generally written in Brahmi script and Prakrit language. In the 3rd century BC, they throw light on Maurya history and Ashoka's achievements. In the 14th century AD, 2 Ashokan pillars inscriptions were found by Firoz Shah Tughlaq, one in Meerut and another at a place called Topra in Haryana. He brought them to Delhi and asked the Pandits of his empire to decipher the inscriptions, but they failed to do so. The same difficulty was faced by the British when, in the last quarter of the 18th century, they discovered Ashokan inscriptions. These epigraphs were first deciphered in 1837 by James Prinsep, a civil servant in the employ of the East India Company in Bengal. We have various types of inscriptions. Some convey royal orders or decisions regarding social, religious, and administrative matters of officials and the people in general. Ashokan inscriptions belong to this category. Otherwise, are votive. Others are votive records of the followers of Buddhism, Jainism, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and the like. They appear on pillars, tablets, temples, or images as marks of devotion. Yet other types eulogy the attributes and achievements of kings and conquerors and ignore that their defeats or weaknesses. To this category belong the Allahabad pillar inscription of Samudragupta. Finally, we have many donative records which refer especially to gifts of money, cattle, land, etc., mainly for religious purposes, made not only by kings and princes but also by artisans and merchants. Inscriptions recording land grants made mainly by chiefs and princes are very important for the study of the land system and administration in ancient India. These were mostly engraved on copper plates. They record grants of land, revenues, and villages made it to monks, priests, temples, monasteries, vessels, and officials. They were written in all languages, including Prakrit, Sanskrit, Tamil, and Telugu. Literary sources. Although the ancient Indians knew how to write as early as 2500 BC out, most ancient manuscripts are not older than the 84th century and are found in Central Asia. In India, they were written on brick bark and palm leaves, but in Central Asia, where the Prakrit language had spread from India, manuscripts were also written in sheep leather and wooden tablets. These writings are called inscriptions, but they are as good as manuscripts. When printing was not known, manuscripts were very highly valued. Although old Sanskrit manuscripts are found all over India, they mostly relate to South India, Kashmir, and Nepal. Currently, inscriptions are largely preserved in museums and manuscripts in libraries. Most ancient books contain religious themes. Hindu religious literature includes the Vedas, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the Purans and the ancient and the like. They throw considerable light on the social and cultural conditions of ancient times, but it is difficult to use them in a context of time and place. The Rig Veda may be assigned to 1500 to 1000 BC through such collections as the Atharva Veda, Yajur Veda, and Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and the Upanishads date roughly to 1000 to 500 BC. Almost every Vedic text contains interpolations which generally appear at the beginning or the end seldom in the middle. The Rig Veda mainly comprises prayers, whereas the later Vedic texts comprise prayers as well as rituals, magics, and mythological stories. However, the Upanishads contains philosophical speculations. In order to understand the Vedic text, it was necessary to study the Vedangas or the limbs of the Veda. These supplements of the Veda comprise phonetics, shiksha, ritual, kalpa, grammar, vyakarana, eulogy. It it ithmo निरुक्ता etymology eulogy निरुक्ता metrics chanda and astronomy jyotisha and much literature grew around each of these subjects. They were written in the form of percepts in prose. A percept was called a sutra because of its brevity. The most famous example of this writing is the grammar of Panini, written around 450 BC. While illustrating the rules of grammar, Panini cast invaluable light on the society, economy, and culture of his times. The two epics and the major Puranas seem to have been finally compiled by AD 400. Of the epics, the Mahabharata, attributed to Vyasa, is older and popularly reflects the state of affairs from the 10th century BC to 84th century. Originally, it consisted of 2800 verses and was called Jaya, or the collection dealing with Viceroy, dealing with victory. These were increased to 24,000 and came to be known as Bharata because it contains the stories of the descendants of one of the earliest Vedic tribes called Bharata. The final compilation increased to verses to 1 lakh, which came to be known as the Mahabharata or the Satyashastri Samhita. Satyashastri Samhita. It contains narrative, descriptive, and didactic material. The main narrative, which relates to the Kaurav Pandav conflict, may relate to the later Vedic period. The descriptive portion might be of the post-Vedic period, and a didactic portion generally relates to the post-Maurya and Gupta period. Similarly, the Ramayana of Valmiki originally consisted of 6,000 verses, which were raised to 12,000 and eventually 24,000. Although these epics appears to be more unified than the Mahabharata, it too has its didactic parts, which were subsequently added. The Ramayana composition started in the 5th century BC. After that, it passed through as many as 5 stages, and 5th stage seems to have been as late as the 12th century AD. As a whole, the text seems to have been composed later than the Mahabharata. In the post-Vedic period, we have a large corpus of ritual literature. Grand public sacrifices to be made by princes of men of subsistence belonging to the three higher varnas are set out in the Saurashtra's, which provide for several ostentatious royal coronation ceremonies. Similarly, domestic rituals connected with birth, naming, scared thread, investiture, marriage, funerals, etc. are prescribed in the Griya Sutras. Sora, both the Shrota Sutras and the Griha Sutras relate to 6,600 to 300 BC. Mention may also be made of the Salva Sutras, which prescribe various kinds of measurements for the construction of sacrificial altars. They mark the beginnings of the study of geometry and mathematics. The religious books of the Jains and the Buddhists refer to historical persons and incidents. The earliest Buddhist texts were written in Pali, which was spoken in Magadha or South Bihar and was basically a form of Prakrit. They were finally compiled in the 1st century BC in the Sri Lanka, but the canonical portions reflect the state of affairs in India in the age of Buddha. They tell us not only about the life of Buddha but also about some of his royal contemporaries who ruled over Magadha, North Bihar, and eastern UP. The most important and interesting portion of the North canonical literature is provided by the stories of the previous births of Gautam Buddha. It was believed that before he was actually born as Gautama, the Buddha passed through over 550 births in many cases in the form of animals. Each birth story is called a Jataka, which is folk tale. The Jataka throw invaluable light on the social and economic conditions of the period between the 5th and 2nd century BC. They also make identical references political events in the age of the Buddha. The Jaina texts were written in Prakrit and were eventually compiled in AD 6th century in Vallabhi in Gujarat. They, however, contain many passages that help us to reconstruct the political history of Eastern UP and Bihar in the age of Mahavira. The Jaina texts refer repeatedly to trade and traders. We also have a large body of secular literature. To this class belong the law books called the Dharma Shastras and Smritis, which together with their commentaries are called Dharma Shastras. The Dharma Shastras were compiled in 500 to 200 BC, and the principal Smritis were confined in the first 6 centuries of the Christian era. They prescribed the duties to be performed by the different varnas as well as by the kings and their officials. They set out the rules for marriage together with the laws according to which property is to be held, sold, and inherited. They also prescribe punishments for persons guilty of theft, assault, murder, adultery, and the like. An important law book is the Arthashastra of Kautilya. The text is divided into 15 books, of which books 2nd and 3rd may be regarded as being of an earlier date and seem to have been the work of different hands. This text was put in its final form in the beginning of the Christian era, but its earliest portion reflects the state of society and economy in the age of Mauryas. It provides rich material for the study of ancient Indian polity and economy. Of the non-religious texts, the grammatical works are very important for historical construction. They begin with the Ashtadhyayi of Panini. Panini lived in the northwestern part of the subcontinent. He is not mentioned in the Pali texts, which principally represent Bihar and UP. Panini is dated to around 450 BC by V.S. Agrawal, who has written about Panini's India in both Hindi and English. In his view, no other text provides as much information about the Janpadas or territorial states of pre-Mauryan times as Panini's does. Patanjali's commentary on Panini, dated 150 BC, supplies valuable information about post-Maurya times. We also have the works of Bhasa, Sudraka, Kalidas, and Banbhatta. Apart from their literary value, they mirror the conditions of the times to which the writers belonged. The works of Kalidas comprise Kavyas and dramas, the most famous of which is Abhigyan Shakuntalam. Besides being great creative compositions, they provide us with glimpses of the social and cultural life of the Guptas. In addition to Sanskrit sources, we have some of the earliest Tamil texts in the corpus of Sangam literature. This literature was produced over a period of 3 to 4 centuries by poets who assembled in colleges patronized by chiefs and kings. Such colleges were called Sangam, and the literature produced in these assemblies was known as Sangam literature. The compilation of this corpus is attributed to the first 4 Christian centuries, although they were rarely completed by the 6th century. The Sangam literature comprises about 30,000 lines of poetry arranged in 8 anthologies called Itutukoi. The poems are collected in groups of 100, such as Purununaru, the 400 of the exterior. There are 2 main groups, Patanikali Kannaku, the 18 lower collections, the Pattu, the 10 songs. The former is generally assumed to be older than the latter and hence is considered to be the great historical importance. The Sangam texts have several layers, but at present these cannot be established on the basis of style of content, but as shown later, they can be detected on the basis of stages in social evolution. The Sangam texts are different from the Vedic texts, particularly the Rig Veda. They do not constitute religious literature. The short and long poems were composed by numerous poets in praise of various heroes and heroines and are thus secular in nature. They are not primitive songs but literature of high quality. Many poems mention a warrior or a chief or a king by name and describe in detail his military exploits. The gifts made by him to bards and warriors are celebrated. These poems may have been recited in the court. They are compared with the heroic poetry of the Homeric age, for they represent a heroic age of warriors and battles. It is difficult to use these texts for historical purposes. Perhaps the proper names, titles, dynasties, territories, wars, and the like mentioned in the poems are partially real. Some of the Cherak kings mentioned in the Sangam text also appear as donors in inscriptions of the 1st and 2nd centuries. The Sangam text refer to too many settlements, including Kaveri Patnam, whose flourishing existence has now been archaeologically corroborated. They also speak of Yavanas coming in their own vessels, purchasing paper with gold, and supplying wine and women's slaves to the natives. This trade is known not only from Latin and Greek writings but also from the archaeological record. The Sangam literature is a major source of our information for the social, economic, and political life of the people living in a deltaic Tamil Nadu in the early Christian centuries. What it says about trade and commerce is confirmed by foreign accounts and archaeological finds. Thanks for watching. We will cover second part. आधा चैप्टर हम सेकेंड पार्ट में कवर करेंगे, जिसमें फॉरेन अकाउंट्स, विलेज स्टडी, नेचुरल साइंसेस, हिस्टोरिकल सेंस और कंस्ट्रक्टिंग हिस्ट्री क्रोनोलॉजी है. थैंक्स फॉर वॉचिंग अगेन.